after 10 generations, the Barlow family no longer resembled the rest of humanity. Their skin carried a strange translucence, veins glimmering faintly beneath like pale rivers under thin ice. Their eyes, wide, almost luminous, seemed to pierce rather than see. For over 2 centuries, cousins had married cousins, children born of the same tangled roots, the same promise whispered in candlelight: purity must never be broken. The world had forgotten them. Their property, hidden behind miles of forest and rusting fences, stood as a mausoleum to a bloodline that refused to die. The few who ventured close, hunters, surveyors, thrill-seeking teenagers, spoke of an unnatural silence that hung over the land. No birds. No insects. Only the sound of breathing that wasn't their own. In the decaying mansion's great hall, portraits of their ancestors stared down with eyes identical to those who now sat beneath them. 10 generations, and yet not a face among them seemed to change. It was as if time had stopped acknowledging the Barlows. But time hadn't stopped, it had been rewritten. On a winter night in 2023, a team of genetic researchers arrived, drawn by rumors of a family that had defied biology itself. What they found inside the house was something they couldn't categorize. Records showing no genetic decay, no fatal mutations, no collapse of the bloodline, only evolution, deliberate and inhuman. Every generation had refined something, shaped something, becoming less mortal and more designed. When the researchers left, or tried to, they realized the gates they entered through were no longer there. The Barlows had opened their doors for the first time in a century, but not to be studied. They had been waiting. And now, their experiment was ready to meet the world. In the year 1803, amid the rolling hills of rural Virginia, the Barlow family gathered inside their ancestral home, a sprawling manor that had already stood for 3 generations. It was on a storm-soaked night that the elders, haunted by superstition and obsessed with control, formed what they called the Pact of Purity. The air inside the candlelit parlor was heavy with incense and whispered prayers, and at the heart of the gathering stood the patriarch, Elias Barlow, a man whose deep-set eyes carried both intelligence and madness. He spoke of the outside world as diseased, its people weak and tainted by greed. The Barlows, he claimed, were chosen guardians of a sacred bloodline that would remain untouched by the corruption of strangers. The pact was written in ink and sealed with blood from each family member's hand, their fingerprints pressed into the parchment like an unholy signature. What began as a declaration of pride soon grew into a doctrine, enforced with quiet severity. No outsider would marry into the family, no new blood would be allowed to dilute what Elias called the divine thread. Cousins were encouraged to wed cousins, uncles to bond their lineage to nieces, all under the guise of preserving something greater than themselves. Over time, this belief became faith, and faith became law. The children born into the family were taught that their blood carried the wisdom of their ancestors, that their closeness to one another was proof of divine favor. To defy the pact was to invite ruin upon the family and the land that sustained them. The years that followed twisted the meaning of love within the household. Marriage ceased to be about choice and became ritual, a sacred duty performed in candlelight under portraits of long-dead relatives. Births were celebrated with reverence, each child considered a vessel of the family's original purity. Yet behind the smiles in family portraits and the hymns sung in their chapel, a quiet unease grew. Some whispered of stillborn children, of deformities hidden from the public eye, of cries that were silenced before dawn. But to question the pact was forbidden. Those who did found themselves cut off from the family, their names erased from the record book that detailed every generation like scripture. The Barlows' obsession with perfection became their curse. The pact of purity that was meant to preserve them bound them tighter with each passing decade, until the family itself became both the altar and the sacrifice, worshipping an idea that no longer belonged to God but to their own delusion. The first defiance came quietly, without warning, and it nearly destroyed the illusion of purity the Barlow family had built over decades. It was 1837 when Jonathan Barlow, a young man born into the 5th generation, fell in love with a woman who did not bear the family name. Her name was Clara, a schoolteacher from a nearby town, gentle and curious, drawn to the strange stillness of the Barlow estate. Jonathan met her by chance when he went to trade supplies, a rare permission granted by his father. For the first time in his life, he felt the pull of something that did not belong to the Barlow creed. Clara's laughter, her unfiltered thoughts, the way she spoke of life beyond their borders, all of it awakened something long buried inside him. He knew he was crossing a forbidden line, but he no longer cared. 4 months, their meetings were secret, hidden in the woods that surrounded the estate. Jonathan would leave at dawn under the guise of tending livestock, returning at dusk with the same blank expression that his family mistook for obedience. But gossip travels even in silence, and soon his mother began to suspect. She found a locket that wasn't of Barlow origin, a trinket Clara had given him, and her scream that night echoed through the halls. The elders convened in the parlor, their faces pale under the candlelight, as Jonathan stood before them and confessed what they feared most: he had married Clara in secret. The words fell like a curse. To the Barlows, his act wasn't rebellion, it was contamination. They locked him away in the West Wing, a room where no one entered and no light reached. Clara waited for him for weeks, sending letters that were never answered. Then, one evening, the townsfolk saw her walking toward the Barlow estate, holding a lantern against the dark. She was never seen again. Some said she drowned in the marsh that bordered the property, others whispered that she had been taken inside and buried among the ancestors. The Barlows never spoke of her. Jonathan's room was found empty a few days later, the window left open, the wind rattling through the broken glass. His name was crossed out in the family Bible, and a single note was written beside it in a trembling hand: "The line must not break again." From that moment on, the family's rules hardened. The younger generation grew up under a stricter silence, warned that love was weakness, and that the outside world existed only to destroy what the Barlows had been chosen to protect. Jonathan's defiance became a story told in whispers, not as a tragedy, but as a lesson in obedience, one that every child learned before they could even spell their own name. The birth of the 12th child was unlike any the Barlows had witnessed before. It happened on a moonless night in 1869, deep within the confines of the estate where no doctor dared to tread. The air was thick with candle smoke and the scent of iron as midwives whispered prayers in trembling voices. The mother, Lydia Barlow, had gone into labor 3 weeks early, her body frail and pale from generations of inbreeding that had weakened the women of the bloodline. Yet when the child emerged, the room fell into a stunned silence. He did not cry. His eyes were open, gray, glassy, and ancient, as though he had been watching from the darkness long before his first breath. The family took his stillness as a sign, not of sickness, but of divine selection. Elias's descendants believed the boy, whom they named Silas, carried the culmination of their sacred bloodline, the perfect vessel their forefathers had promised would one day arrive. His skin was nearly translucent, the veins beneath it forming faint blue patterns that pulsed with unnatural rhythm. When the midwife pricked his heel, expecting him to wail, he did not react. The knife drew blood, but Silas did not flinch. He felt no pain. To the family, it was not a defect, it was proof of his superiority. They whispered that he had been born beyond suffering, beyond mortality itself. As Silas grew, his strangeness only deepened. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words came measured and cold, as though he were reciting thoughts not his own. Animals avoided him, dogs whimpered when he approached. His presence carried a weight that unsettled even his elders. He could go for days without food or sleep, and his wounds healed faster than any of the others. When a hunting accident left him with a deep gash across his arm, the skin closed overnight without a trace of blood. The family began to revere him as the living proof, the child who confirmed that their centuries of sacrifice had been justified. Outsiders who caught glimpses of him through the gates called him the Pale Boy. Rumors spread that he was a ghost or an omen, but no one dared approach. Inside the mansion, Silas became the centerpiece of every gathering, the reason behind every prayer. The elders claimed he was not simply human but a bridge between flesh and something eternal. Yet, beneath the reverence, fear began to grow, fear of what they had created, fear of the quiet power that shimmered behind his lifeless eyes. For the first time, the family's belief in purity began to tremble beneath the weight of its own creation, as if nature itself had grown tired of their defiance and sent them a reminder that some perfection should never exist. As the decades passed, the Barlow family's presence in society began to fade like the echo of a name once feared. By the turn of the 20th century, their estate stood isolated, surrounded by a dense tangle of trees and swampland that seemed to grow thicker with each passing year. The nearby townsfolk had long since stopped visiting, frightened by rumors of strange cries that drifted from the woods at night and lights that flickered in the windows of the great house, though no one claimed to live there anymore. For the Barlows, isolation was no longer a choice, it was survival. They had withdrawn entirely from the outside world, convinced that separation was the only way to protect their sacred lineage from contamination. The mansion became a self-contained world, a decaying kingdom where generations of cousins, uncles, and nieces lived under a single roof. The air was heavy with candle smoke and the scent of mildew, and the halls echoed with footsteps that never seemed to fade. Windows were boarded up, and the once grand gardens were left to rot, the statues overtaken by vines. The family grew their own food, taught their own children, and buried their dead in an overgrown cemetery behind the house. Every inch of their existence was controlled, watched, and documented in the family ledger, the book that kept their bloodline unbroken. Their retreat into seclusion also deepened their delusions. They began to believe the land itself was bound to their survival, that the soil beneath their home carried the essence of their ancestors. Each generation was taught that stepping beyond the woods without permission would bring ruin, that the outside world was a trap set by those jealous of their purity. The children grew up knowing no strangers, no other voices, no other truths. Their language began to warp, their words slower, quieter, touched by the strange cadence of isolation. The eldest among them, often blind or frail, ruled with reverence and fear. They claimed to hear whispers from the spirits of the ancestors, commanding them to keep the blood untainted. When the youngest questioned why the world outside was forbidden, they were taken to the cellar to pray until their curiosity faded. With each generation, the Barlows' reality folded inward, twisting into something unrecognizable. By the 1920s, outsiders rarely even remembered the family's name. The road to the estate had all but disappeared, swallowed by the forest. And deep within those trees, the Barlows continued to thrive in their strange, secret world, hidden from time, untouched by progress, and governed by rules that had long since stopped being human. It began with whispers among the townsfolk who still lived near the forgotten borders of the Barlow property. They spoke of a figure seen at dusk, moving between the trees like a shadow that refused to vanish with the setting sun. The first to see it was an old trapper who claimed he had caught sight of something with the outline of a man but the gait of an animal, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilting at an angle no human neck could bear. He called it the Watcher, a name that spread quietly through the town like an infection. At first, no one believed him. The Barlows had been a ghost story for generations, a warning told to children to keep them from wandering too far. But as more sightings followed, even the skeptics began to avoid the woods after dark. Those who ventured too close to the family's land reported hearing faint whispers carried on the wind, voices that seemed to echo their own names. Dogs refused to go near the fence line, barking and howling at something unseen. Hunters found tracks in the mud, bare footprints with toes elongated and uneven, as if belonging to someone who had forgotten how to walk upright. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath when night fell. The birds stopped singing, and even the insects grew silent. The Barlow estate stood at the heart of it all, a decaying monument surrounded by an unnatural calm. Inside the mansion, the remaining family members spoke of the Watcher not with fear, but with reverence. They believed it to be one of their own, an ancestor who had transcended mortality. According to family lore, the Watcher was born generations earlier, one of the lost children buried beneath the cellar, and had risen again to protect the bloodline from intruders. They claimed he walked the perimeter of the land to guard their sacred isolation, ensuring no outsider would bring impurity into their midst. Some whispered that the Watcher was not guarding them at all, but watching, waiting for something. When a group of surveyors arrived one autumn to map the area, only 2 returned. They refused to speak of what they had seen, their clothes torn, their faces pale with terror. The locals found their abandoned equipment days later near the Barlow property line, cameras smashed and notes burned to ash. The stories that followed blurred the line between myth and truth, but one detail remained constant in every account: the eyes. Those who had seen the Watcher described eyes that gleamed like mirrors in the dark, reflecting not light, but the face of whoever dared to look back. The discovery of the family Bible came almost by accident, found by a university researcher named Dr. Nathan Cole, who had spent years studying isolated genetic communities. Rumors of the Barlow family's strange lineage had long circulated in academic circles, dismissed as folklore until a local historian mentioned an abandoned estate still standing deep in the Appalachian woods. Driven by curiosity, Cole made the journey himself, hiking miles through overgrown trails and mist-soaked trees until he reached what remained of the Barlow mansion. The house was silent, its walls bowed inward, its windows shattered, yet inside, everything seemed untouched by time. Dust coated the furniture like a burial shroud, and faded portraits stared down with eyes that seemed far too alive. It was in the study that Cole found the book, massive, leather-bound, and sealed with a rusted clasp. The cover bore a single word carved in elegant script, *lineage. When he opened it, the scent of old paper and decay filled the air. Every page was filled with names, birthdates, and hand-drawn family trees stretching back to the early 1800s. But what caught his attention were the notations beside certain names, small, delicate marks that looked like symbols. At first, he assumed they referred to illnesses or deformities, but as he translated the accompanying notes written in the margins, his unease deepened. The symbols didn't describe defects, they celebrated them. Words like purified, strengthened, and refined appeared next to children who had been born with abnormalities that should have been fatal. Further into the book, the writing changed. The script became more erratic, the ink darker, as if the author had written in a frenzy. There were passages describing blessings of the flesh, the chosen marrow, and the cleansing of the impure through birthright. Cole realized the Bible was not a religious artifact at all but a genetic record, documenting each generation's physical changes as part of a deliberate process. The Barlows had not simply endured their condition, they had worshipped it, interpreting mutation as divine evolution. Cole photographed several pages before night fell, intending to return for a full examination. But as he packed his equipment, he noticed fresh footprints in the dust that did not belong to him. The air in the house grew colder, and a faint sound echoed from the floor above, a dragging step, slow and deliberate. When he turned toward the doorway, the shadows seemed to move. By dawn, his car was found at the edge of the forest, doors open, headlights still on. The book he had discovered was gone, as though it had been reclaimed by the family it was never meant to leave. Beneath the Barlow mansion, hidden behind a false wall in the cellar, lay a room no one spoke of but everyone knew existed. It was first discovered by a groundskeeper in 1904 who, while attempting to repair the crumbling foundation, noticed a draft coming from behind a stone archway. When he pried it open, the stench of rot and formaldehyde poured out like a memory that had been buried too long. Inside were rows of glass jars filled with murky fluid, each one containing something small, pale, and silent. Some held what were unmistakably human remains, tiny limbs, malformed skulls, things that seemed halfway between human and something else entirely. The walls were lined with wooden crates marked only with initials and dates, some going back nearly a century. In the center of the room stood an iron table, rusted with age, surrounded by tools that no one could mistake for medical instruments. When the family was questioned, their answer was always the same: it was a burial place for the imperfect. They spoke of it not with sorrow, but with reverence. For them, this hidden chamber was sacred ground, a place where those who did not survive the birthright were preserved, not mourned. The elders taught that every generation's failures had to be remembered, not erased, because within each imperfection lay a step toward the family's final evolution. They believed that by preserving the remains, they were honoring the sacrifices that shaped their blood. The cellar became a shrine to both devotion and denial, a gallery of the family's obsession etched into flesh. When outsiders stumbled upon the truth, the Barlows erased them just as efficiently as they erased their own errors. Local workers who ventured too close to the property vanished without trace, their names never recorded. Yet those who did glimpse the cellar spoke of the unsettling peace that filled the air, how even the dead seemed to be watching. A faint humming, like a low vibration, could sometimes be heard beneath the floorboards of the mansion on cold nights, and the family claimed it was the voices of their ancestors singing beneath the earth. Over time, the cellar became more than just a resting place. It was where births were blessed and marriages sealed, where children were taken to understand the cost of their heritage. To enter, it was to face the truth of what it meant to be a Barlow, to know that purity had a price, and that the family's perfection was built upon the quiet preservation of those who had not been strong enough to survive it. By the time the 12th generation was born, the Barlow family had become something far removed from what their ancestors once were. Their skin had grown almost translucent, their eyes pale and reflective, their features eerily symmetrical, as though carved from the same template. The birth of the twins, Elias and Evelyn, was heralded as the fulfillment of a prophecy written in the family Bible. They were born under a lunar eclipse, their cries eerily synchronized, and from their first breath, it was clear they were unlike any children before them. Neither cried in pain or fear, their expressions remained calm and detached, as though they had already seen the world and found it wanting. Their pulse was slower than normal, their body temperature colder, and their pupils contracted even in darkness. The midwives who assisted their birth refused to return to the house, whispering that the twins had been born without souls. As they grew, their differences became more pronounced. Elias spoke fluently before he was a year old, forming full sentences with an eerie precision that unnerved even the elders. Evelyn, on the other hand, barely spoke at all, but her silence carried power. People said she could make the candles flicker just by staring at them, that she knew when someone was lying before a word left their mouth. The two shared an intelligence that felt alien, their thoughts so in sync they often finished each other's sentences or reacted to pain the other hadn't yet expressed. Their connection went beyond human comprehension, a perfect mirror that reflected the family's centuries of obsession. The elders called them the culmination, believing the bloodline had finally transcended ordinary humanity. The children were treated not as offspring but as living relics, kept within the house, watched constantly, worshipped by relatives who spoke of destiny and divine perfection. Yet the more the family adored them, the colder the twins became. They watched their kin with quiet amusement, speaking less as they grew older, their eyes reflecting not love but curiosity, as if studying the humans who surrounded them. The other children in the household avoided them, claiming they could hear voices when the twins were near, soft whispers that spoke in languages no one recognized. When Elias and Evelyn turned, strange phenomena began to plague the estate. The clocks stopped at the same hour every night, mirrors cracked without cause, and small animals were found dead near the gates, their eyes clouded white. The family took it as a sign that the twins were crossing the threshold between flesh and something divine. But there were others who whispered a darker truth, that the Barlows had finally succeeded in creating what nature had spent centuries trying to prevent. The government investigation began quietly, with rumors that reached the ears of a genetic research agency in Washington. Reports of an isolated family showing no signs of genetic collapse despite generations of inbreeding had circulated for years, dismissed as rural folklore. But when a series of unexplained deaths occurred near the old Barlow property, including that of a missing historian and a research assistant, the case was reopened. A small investigative team was sent to the region under the guise of a rural health study. What they found defied every principle of human biology they had ever known. The few remaining Barlows, though pale and gaunt, displayed an unnatural uniformity, each member sharing the same symmetrical facial structure, identical bone density, and near-perfect eyesight. More disturbingly, their DNA revealed sequences that should not have existed. Instead of the mutations expected from centuries of intermarriage, their genetic code appeared to have repaired itself, evolving into a form no human genome had ever recorded. The lead geneticist, Dr. Marianne Fletcher, described the findings as impossible. There were no traces of hereditary disorders, no indicators of chromosomal decay. Instead, there was something new, an unknown sequence that replicated itself with precision, erasing all evidence of weakness. Fletcher's team theorized that the family had undergone a spontaneous form of directed evolution, one that replaced natural selection with something deliberate, perhaps even conscious. When they attempted to take blood samples, however, complications began to arise. The samples coagulated almost instantly, darkening into a thick substance that resisted chemical breakdown. Even under high magnification, the cells did not behave like human cells, they pulsed faintly, as though alive in ways beyond biology. The investigators requested to enter the estate for deeper research, but by the time they arrived, the mansion stood empty. Dust covered the floors, furniture was overturned, and the air carried a faint metallic tang, like blood left too long in the open. In the basement, they found walls covered with diagrams of the human genome written in ink and ash. Words like completion, purity, and ascension were scrawled between formulas that seemed to merge science with ritual. A child's toy was found beside a chair, its surface covered in small handprints that glowed faintly under ultraviolet light. The team's final report was never released to the public. Of the 6 members who entered the house, only 2 returned, both suffering from severe psychological trauma. They spoke of hearing voices that called them by name and of eyes watching from the dark, eyes that looked human but weren't. The investigation was officially closed, the Barlow property condemned, and the records sealed under national security orders. But years later, in an unmarked lab drawer, one of the original blood samples was found, still pulsing softly inside its vial. The final revelation came from the only surviving heir of the Barlow bloodline, a man who called himself Elias 12, though records suggested he should not have been alive at all. He appeared one winter morning at a rural police station miles from the family estate, barefoot, dressed in tattered clothing, and carrying a single leather-bound journal. His skin was unnervingly pale, almost translucent, and his voice had a calm, rhythmic cadence that unsettled everyone who heard it. When questioned about where he had come from, he simply smiled and said the family had completed the design. The officers assumed he was delirious, perhaps a survivor of some cult, but when federal agents arrived to take him into custody, the air in the interrogation room reportedly grew colder, and one of the lights began to flicker. The agents described a feeling of pressure in their skulls, as if their thoughts were being pulled apart and rearranged. Elias only watched them, his expression serene. In the days that followed, he revealed fragments of what had occurred within the Barlow estate. The family, he claimed, had reached the point of transcendence. Through centuries of calculated unions and unwavering devotion to their creed, they had shed the limitations of human biology. Mutation, which the world saw as disease, was their key to evolution. They had rewritten their own code, guided not by science but by instinct, a kind of inherited will embedded in their blood. Elias spoke of the awakening, an event in which the twins, Elias and Evelyn of the 12th generation, merged their consciousness into the collective memory of the family, forming something beyond individuality. They were no longer separate beings but one entity, bound by a shared mind that stretched backward through every ancestor and forward into every unborn heir. When scientists examined Elias's DNA, it confirmed what he had said. His genetic structure was unlike anything catalogued, showing traits that no human should possess: self-repairing strands, resistance to aging, and patterns that seemed to shift each time they were observed. It was as if his genome were aware of being studied and altered itself in response. He spoke with quiet certainty, explaining that the Barlows had not defied nature but fulfilled it. Humanity, he said, was designed to evolve beyond itself, and his family had simply been the first to finish the process. The agents who interviewed him later reported disturbing dreams, voices whispering in forgotten languages, the sound of heartbeats echoing from unseen places. When they returned to his cell the following morning, Elias was gone. The surveillance footage showed him sitting motionless, eyes open, until the moment the lights flickered. Then, in a single frame, he vanished, leaving behind only the journal and the faint, rhythmic sound of something breathing within the walls.